It began, as such tales often do, on a fog-drenched London morning. The kind of mist that muffled footsteps and turned gas lamps into hazy ghosts. Chief Inspector Fleming stood staring at the fourth-floor window of number 12 Gorswell Terrace, or more precisely, at the space where a window should have been. "It's not broken," he muttered. "It's not open. It's simply not there." The window had vanished, not boarded up, not hidden behind drapery. Gone, as if it had never existed. Yet every blueprint, every photograph, every record of the building insisted that a window should be right there, centered above the study's oak desk. What made it more troubling was the body sprawled below. Jonathan Edivane, a retired antiquarian of no great fame, but considerable eccentricity, had been found dead that morning by his housekeeper. The study door had been locked from the inside, the only key found in the victim's pocket. The windows in the room aside from the one that now wasn't were sealed, and the chimney, long bricked up, offered no passage. No sign of forced entry, no weapon. Just a single object on the desk beside Edivane's crumpled frame, a brass telescope, pointed not at the absent window, but toward the blank wall. "It's impossible," Fleming said again, more to himself than to the uniformed officers scribbling notes behind him, which was precisely when Harriet Vane stepped into the room. Harriet, with her sharp cheekbones, gloved hands, and habitual air of observing more than she let on, wore black as though it were armor. "You summoned Lord Peter?" she asked quietly. "He's away in Rome," Fleming replied. "But he said you'd do. Frankly, I'm not sure what there is to do. The man's dead, in a locked room, with no means of entry or exit, and the damned windows missing." Harriet stepped around the desk, eyes flitting over Edivane's slack features. He looked surprised more than afraid. A man startled by the unexpected, not murdered in panic. Her gaze moved to the telescope. She adjusted it, peering through the lens. "What did he expect to see?" she asked softly. Fleming shrugged. He was an amateur astronomer. "Maybe the moon, facing a wall." She knelt beside the body. No blood, no bruises, no defensive wounds. Was there a postmortem? Just beginning. No obvious trauma. No sign of poison? None. No glass, no syringe, no powder. She examined the bookshelves next. Two rows of identical bindings, Catalogus Stellarum Antiquus, all arranged precisely. She murmured. He was methodical. The housekeeper, a shrewd woman named Mrs. Prentice, was called in. He never had callers, she said, kept to himself. But last night, just past 11, I heard him moving about. That wasn't unusual. What was though? She hesitated. "I heard glass. Breaking?" Harriet asked. "No, sliding. Like a sash window being opened." "But there is no window," Fleming said. Mrs. Prentice's look was withering. "There was, sir. I dusted it yesterday." Harriet's voice was quiet. "You're sure?" "100 times I've dusted that sill, wiped that glass. He always kept it shut and locked. But it was there. And this morning," Mrs. Prentice hesitated, "a wall, as if someone bricked it up overnight. But it's the same plaster as the rest of the house. Paint matches too. I touched it, miss. Cold and hard as stone." Harriet walked to the wall, tracing the smooth surface. So either a window vanished, or a wall appeared. Fleming's patience was fraying. "This isn't a ghost story, Miss Vane. No man walks through stone." "No," Harriet agreed. "But they might make someone think they did, later, in the narrow drawing room." She examined Edivane's belongings. The telescope had no fingerprints wiped clean. A receipt found in his coat pocket noted the purchase of a rare star chart the day before. The chart, however, was missing, but tucked inside a hollow in one of the book's observations from the Lick Observatory. She found a torn envelope. Its return address read, Fenwick and Gray, theatrical set designers. She smiled slightly. Now, why would an antiquarian be in touch with stage painters? That evening, Harriet returned to the study alone. She lit a candle and sat at the desk, telescope in hand. Ray adjusting the angle toward the blank wall, she peered through the lens again. And this time, she saw it, a faint outline, a shape, circular, smudged, and distant. Not on the wall, but within it. Like a projected image on a veil, she moved the telescope, and the image vanished. Realigned it, and there it was again. She paced back, the illusion held only at a precise angle. Not an image on the wall, then, but a reflection from something else. She turned to the bookcase. The volumes were all real, but behind the third shelf, the backboard was newer. She pressed. It gave slightly, removing the books. She found the panel opened inward. Inside, narrow space and a descending metal ladder. She climbed. Below, in the hidden room, was a projector, old but powerful and angled precisely to reflect an image through a hidden aperture. Behind the wall, a complex system of mirrors and painted panels created the illusion of a blank wall where once there had been a window. It was an elaborate trick, a theatrical trompe-l'oeil of the highest order, and in the center of the floor lay a set of theater blueprints. The layout of the study, precisely replicated on paper, measurements, angles, light sources, and a single note scribbled in ink. Test successful. He suspects nothing. The signature was barely legible. C. Fenwick. Harriet climbed back up. Now it made sense. Edivane was lured to believe he had seen something outside the window, perhaps a celestial event, or a flash of light, only to find the window no longer existed. The shock must have triggered something in him. A seizure, a collapse, not murder. Perhaps, but calculated manipulation. The real mystery wasn't who entered the room, but who made Edivane think the world had changed. The motive, she guessed, lay in the missing star chart and the rare astronomical records Edivane had recently acquired. If someone knew he had found something valuable, something he hadn't yet catalogued, they might need him gone to claim it. She telephoned Lord Peter in Rome. "Darling," she said, "did you ever meet a theatrical illusionist named Charles Fenwick?" Peter's laugh crackled over the line. "Used to fake train crashes at the Palladium. Last I heard, he was designing window tricks for a Paris magic review." Harriet's smile was grim. "He's upgraded. He's removing windows entirely now." She hung up. It was murder by deception, death by constructed unreality. And somewhere, out there, a man who painted over truth with such finesse that a scholar died gazing at a wall, believing he'd gone mad. But Harriet Vane had seen through the illusion, and she knew where to begin. The following morning, the clouds hung low and heavy, the kind that threatened rain, but refused to deliver it. Harriet arrived once more at number 12 Gorswell Terrace, her gloved hand tightening briefly on the iron gate before she stepped through. The street still bore the hush of lingering curiosity, neighbors whispering behind drawn curtains, their gossip muffled by lace and shutter. Inside, Chief Inspector Fleming was already in the study. The chalk outlines faded now, the desk cleared, the blank wall as impassive as ever. "Post-mortem's in," he said without preamble. No signs of trauma, poison, or natural failure. But his heart stopped suddenly. Possibly shock-induced. The coroner's baffled. Then he died believing the window had vanished, Harriet replied. Or more precisely, believing his mind was collapsing. She turned to the wall again, thoughtful. "This isn't about astronomy. It's about misdirection." Fleming gave a tired sigh. "You found the projector and the hidden room. I'll grant you that. But there's no evidence Fenwick ever set foot here. No fingerprints, no trail. Which makes him very careful," Harriet said. She drifted through the room again, slower this time, letting her eye scan for disruption, not what was present, but what was wrong. A keen eye didn't just see, it noticed. And today, something subtle pricked at her. "Has anything been removed?" she asked. "Not as far as we can tell. Everything's intact." But she didn't believe that. Harriet returned to the bookcase. The volumes were as she remembered, lined in their fussy, leather-bound arrogance. Yet something felt unsettled. She leaned closer. "Volume 7 is dustier than the rest," she said softly. Fleming peered beside her. So it hasn't been touched as often. But there's an indentation in the velvet lining of the shelf. Something narrower used to be there." Fleming straightened. "You think something's missing?" "I know it." Harriet stepped back, hands clasped behind her. The shelf held something else recently removed. It sat between the books, but it wasn't a book. Something important. She turned just as the door creaked open. A tall man in a threadbare gray overcoat entered, his hat dripping with dew. His face was long and sharp, with the pinched severity of someone who rarely smiled, and never frivolously. In his hand was a small case, from which protruded an envelope. "I take it you are Miss Vane?" he asked. She nodded. "Detective Inspector Merivale. Special assignments. Fleming called me in." Fleming cleared his throat. "Thought we'd benefit from a fresh set of eyes." Merivale's eyes, it turned out, were not merely fresh, they were surgical. He began without ceremony, walking the perimeter of the room, saying nothing, touching nothing. When he finally spoke, it was to Harriet. "The window that vanished, was it a true architectural removal or illusion?" "Illusion," she said. "Crafted by theatrical trickery. The real window was covered by a false wall, one designed to reflect an identical interior and hide the external view. A projector created the rest, and the motive, that's where the picture blurs." Merivale crouched beside the baseboard under the false wall. He flicked his penlight along the edge. "Dust trails," he murmured, "disrupted here and there." He pressed a small panel. A hollow sound answered. Fleming looked astonished. "Another hidden compartment." Merivale didn't answer. He worked his fingers along the seam and opened the panel with a soft click. Inside lay a narrow recess, and within it, a long velvet-lined case. He removed it gently. It held an ancient-looking scroll, bound with wax thread. Harriet exhaled. "Edavane's last purchase, the missing star chart." Merivale nodded. "Why hide it, though?" "Because someone was after it," Harriet said. "Someone who knew its value." They unbound the thread with care. The parchment was brittle but remarkably intact. It bore no modern markings, just star positions and angular notations written in Latin. At the base, a name, Hipparchus. Harriet blinked. "This is no ordinary chart. It's a lost fragment of Hipparchus's original stellar catalogue." Fleming looked baffled. "Never heard of him. One of the earliest known astronomers. 2nd century BC, most of his charts were destroyed. This would be priceless to the right collector." Merivale raised an eyebrow. "And worth killing for, or manipulating," Harriet corrected. "Edavane may have been frightened to the point of death, but I doubt that was the original plan." They replaced the scroll and carefully documented the find. As they did, Harriet noticed Merivale's eyes had narrowed toward the carpet beneath the desk. "You've seen something," she said. "A hair," he replied, extracting it with tweezers. "Blonde. Not Edavane's, he was almost entirely gray." Harriet's thoughts clicked into motion. "Fenwick, no record of his appearance," Merivale said. "But we'll test the DNA." Harriet moved to the mantel. A clock ticked there, slow and ponderous. Her fingers brushed the surface, then stopped. "The clock's been moved," she said. Merivale joined her. "How can you tell?" "The dust ring," she said, pointing. "See, it's uneven. Someone shifted it, then returned it, just not perfectly." They lifted the clock. Beneath it, folded tightly, was a receipt, Dunmore's Curios, purchased under the name A. Brightwell. Harriet read aloud. "An alias, perhaps?" Merivale tucked the receipt into his notebook. "I'll trace it." Harriet turned as a sound echoed from the stairs. Mrs. Prentice had returned, balancing a tray with tea and a solemn expression. "Pardon the interruption, miss," she said, setting the tray down. "I just remembered something. Yes, the night Mr. Edavane died, I saw someone, across the road, just standing, watching the house." "Man or woman?" Merivale asked. "Hard to tell. Long coat, blonde hair, might have been a wig." When I opened the curtain, they walked off down Whistler Lane. Time, few minutes past 11. The same time she'd heard the sound glass sliding. Harriet looked at Merivale. "That's the connection. Someone needed Edavane to see something through that window just once, long enough to unsettle him. But he died," Merivale said. "And that may not have been part of the plan," Harriet murmured. "Unless it was." The silence in the study thickened. Then Merivale spoke again, quiet and decisive. "We're not chasing a thief. We're dealing with a professional manipulator. Someone who understands perception and illusion better than truth. This was rehearsed." Harriet's eyes darkened. "Then we find the stage, and the next act." Rain began to fall just past midday, a soft drizzle that spattered against the windows of number 12 Gorswell Terrace, and brought with it a hush to the street outside. Inside, Harriet Vane and Inspector Merivale sat opposite the housekeeper. Mrs. Prentice, At the kitchen table, the tea she had brewed earlier now sat untouched. "Let's go over it again," slowly Harriet said gently. "You say you heard the sash window open?" "Yes, miss, a sound I know well. I've lived here long enough. It slid upward clean, quiet." Merivale leaned forward slightly. "And yet the window no longer exists." "Exactly. But I heard it. Just once, then nothing. And the figure across the road?" Mrs. Prentice nodded. "Standing in the shadows, just still, not smoking, not fidgeting, as if waiting for something to happen. Could they have been watching the window?" Harriet asked. "Possibly. But when I opened the curtain, they moved off, quick and smooth like." "Did you get a look at their face?" "No, sir. Just the hair, blonde. But something about the way they walked too purposeful to be frightened. Almost like it was part of a plan." Merivale scribbled a note, then looked up. "And Mr. Edivane, how was he in the days before his death?" "Nervous, excited. Both," said Mrs. Prentice. "He'd been poring over that chart for days. Said it was going to shift some old beliefs, but he didn't say how. He barely slept. Last I saw of him alive, he was bent over that telescope, whispering to himself. Do you recall what he said?" She hesitated. "Only bits. Something about hidden alignments and stars beyond time. I thought it was just poetry." Harriet exchanged a glance with Merivale. They both knew the kind of obsession that could drive a man to the edge. As Mrs. Prentice excused herself, a knock came at the front door. Fleming returned moments later with a tall, narrow man in a rain-dark coat and pale gloves. His eyes were a watery blue, his movements precise. He introduced himself as Owen Cattermole, Edivane's solicitor. "Miss Vane, Inspector. I understand you've discovered something regarding my client's possessions?" Merivale nodded. "You managed Mr. Edivane's estate entirely. He had no direct heirs, but a rather complicated arrangement for posthumous donations to certain academic bodies." "Did he ever mention fearing for his safety?" Harriet asked. Jonathan: "No. He was cautious by nature, yes, but not fearful. I would describe him as intellectually defensive, particularly about his recent acquisition, the Hipparchus chart." Cattermole nodded slowly. "He believed it would be the cornerstone of his legacy." Harriet's voice was casual. "Do you know if anyone else had an interest in it?" "Oh, certainly. I received inquiries. 2, in fact. One from a professor Dorian held at St. Cyprian's College wrote a rather eloquent letter, requesting access. The other was far less refined. A Mistress Leving, an antiquities dealer of uncertain reputation. Did Mr. Edivane agree to meet either?" "Not Professor Held, but Miss Leving, yes. He said she intrigued him, that she had a theatrical mind." Harriet stood. "We'll need her address." Cattermole handed it over without fuss. "Though I caution you, she strikes me as someone who performs even in silence." By late afternoon, the rain had thickened to a steady fall, and the winding streets led them to a dimly lit shopfront in Islington. "Leving's Antiquaria," the hand-painted sign read. Inside, dust shimmered in low yellow light, and the shelves groaned with items too old to be honest. Tris Leving herself appeared from the back, a woman in her early 30s, hair dyed an improbable chestnut, lips painted with an overconfident smirk. "You're not here to buy," she said without pleasantry. "No," Harriet replied. "We're here about Jonathan Edivane. I figured someone would come sniffing eventually." She gestured them toward a cluttered table. "He was a strange one. Brilliant, but too careful. Couldn't tell if he was guarding a secret or hiding from one." "You met him?" Merivale asked. "Only once, 2 weeks ago. I'd heard he had the chart, offered to buy it. He refused, said he wasn't ready, then got all cagey and started asking me about optical illusions and the geometry of mirrors." Harriet's eyebrow arched. "That's a curious topic for an antiquarian." "I thought so too," Tris said. "But then Jonathan had a theory that the chart didn't just map the stars, but hid something in plain sight, a secret star, or a pattern, maybe something buried in the alignments." Merivale folded his arms. "And you just walked away after that?" Tris gave a quick smile. "Not exactly. I put out feelers. Thought maybe if someone else got to him, scared him a little, he'd sell." Harriet's voice dropped. "What sort of feelers?" "Nothing criminal, just persuasive. A friend in theater knows how to make people question what they're seeing. A bit of mirror play. A light or two. Spook him into loosening his grip. You sent Charles Fenwick. The smile faltered. I didn't send him. I just mentioned the situation. He took interest on his own. And now Edivane is dead. Tris looked away. I never meant for it to go that far. Jonathan wasn't supposed to die. He was just supposed to doubt himself. But someone knew that doubt could kill him. Harriet said quietly. As they left the shop, Harriet's thoughts moved like chess pieces. Fenwick was the architect. Yes, but who had asked for the blueprint? Tris had motive. So did the professor. But neither, so far, had told the entire truth. That evening, back at Gorswell Terrace, Professor Dorian Held arrived. He was elegant in the academic creased trousers, precise vowels, and the distracted air of someone always thinking of something else. Jonathan was a peer, he said. A rival, yes, but one I respected. We shared a fascination with ancient star charts. When I learned he had acquired the Hipparchus fragment, I offered collaboration. Was he open to it? Harriet asked. Not remotely. He became territorial. Accused me of trying to undermine him. But I assure you, I had no reason to harm him. You didn't know Tris Leving, only by reputation. I suspect she'd self-forged papyri if the light was dim enough. And Charles Fenwick, Professor Held blinked. The illusionist. I've seen one of his shows, but that's all. Harriet watched him closely. To calm. To prepared. Did you ever visit this house? No, Jonathan wouldn't allow it. But his gaze had flicked, just once, to the empty space where the missing window had been. When he left, Merivale broke the silence. He lied. About visiting, Harriet said. And perhaps more. The contradictions subtle but telling. He claimed rivalry, yet spoke of respect. Offered partnership, but knew Edivane wouldn't accept. It felt rehearsed. They all feel rehearsed. Harriet murmured. Tris Held, even the solicitor to a degree. Everyone's adjusting their story. And someone, Merivale said, built a deception strong enough to kill. Harriet looked at the wall again. What it had hidden wasn't just a view, but intent. Someone had weaponized perception, manipulated fear, bent truth just far enough to snap a man's mind. And the killer, she suspected, hadn't finished their performance yet. The next morning began gray and close, the kind of airless July day that promised storms, but delivered only stillness. Harriet Vane arrived at Gorswell Terrace before the first bell of the postman, carrying a small notebook and a face sharpened by sleep and thought. Inspector Merivale was already there, crouched by the skirting of the back room where the telescope once pointed through a window that no longer existed. The plaster's been redone, he said without looking up. Just this section, the paint's fresher, the cut cleaner. Harriet crouched beside him, an illusion. Then, not a window boarded up, but a wall repainted to erase one entirely, exactly. The missing pane was never broken. It was never there when we arrived. He stood and dusted off his knees. Edivane may have seen a star that didn't exist. Or perhaps he was never looking at stars at all. Harriet flipped through her notes. Let's start with motive. Tris Leving, ambitious, opportunistic. She had every reason to want the chart if not to sell, then to unravel it. Her association with Fenwick links her to the night of the illusion. And Professor Held, said Merivale, academic rivalry bordering on obsession. If Edivane's chart discredited his theories, Held's career would shrink overnight. Cattermole, the solicitor, Harriet added, stands to oversee the transfer of Edivane's estate. There's no indication of embezzlement, but it's possible he facilitated something, perhaps unknowingly, perhaps not. And then there's Fenwick himself, Merivale said, a performer by trade, a manipulator by instinct. But why help Leving for nothing, unless he had something to gain? Harriet tapped her pen. Fear, perhaps, or loyalty, or something buried deeper. By midday, they had secured alibis from Tris and Cattermole. Leving had been on stage the night of the death, confirmed by both a theater manager and a signed logbook. Cattermole had an appointment with a notary, and time-stamped parking records placed him in South Kensington. Only Professor Held's movements remained suspiciously vague. I was working late at the college, he'd said when they called again. No one was with me, but the night porter saw me leave just after midnight." Harriet had nodded but made no comment. That was enough time to walk from St. Cyprian's to Gorswell Terrace and back again, if one were so inclined. She revisited the diagram that Edivane had been drawing, tiny marks in blue pencil, still visible under the desk lamp. They were not constellations, not quite. They formed a triangle, not of stars, but of vantage points and observational geometry. One angle matched the terrace window, another, the rooftop across the street. "Someone staged a viewing," she murmured. Merivale looked over her shoulder, not to observe but to be observed. The illusion wasn't just for Edivane. Someone else needed to see his reaction. Harriet stood suddenly. "Come on. I want to talk to Fenwick again." They found him not at his theater but in a small rehearsal studio behind a closed pub, hunched over a half-assembled mirror rig. The room smelled of sawdust and glue. When he looked up and saw Harriet, he gave a weary nod. "I'm not surprised," he said. "You're not the sort who lets mysteries stay tangled." "Why did you do it?" Harriet asked without preamble. "I was asked. Trish thought a good shock would make Edivane part with that chart. I agreed. But that's all it was supposed to be, a little theatrical fright. Except you weren't the only one with a stake in this," she said. "Who else was there that night?" Fenwick paused, his hands clenched around the mirror frame. "I don't know names, but I saw a man across the road, blond, well-dressed, watching me work." "He shouldn't have been there." "Held?" Merivale asked. "Could be. I've only seen him in photographs, but whoever it was, they didn't interfere. Just watched. When Edivane collapsed, he vanished. So he saw the collapse, maybe even counted on it." Harriet's voice was cold. "You were just a cog, Fenwick. The real mechanism was set by someone else." They left him in silence and returned to the terrace. Harriet stood in the study again, staring at the wall that once framed a view. A deception deliberate, calculated, not to frighten Edivane, but to break him, to prove something. She examined the baseboard again and found it a slip of paper, wedged behind the desk, thin, torn along one edge, and bearing only for words in a cramped, almost frantic hand. It was never visible. She read it aloud. Merivale frowned. "What wasn't?" "The alignment," Harriet whispered. "The star, the chart." Edivane must have discovered something he couldn't see, something he believed was hidden, a missing object in the pattern, and it drove him to madness. No, it confirmed what he already feared, that someone had altered the truth. The chart didn't reveal something celestial. It revealed a human lie. Back at the Yard, they requested full documentation on Professor Held's publications. One in particular stood out. A 2011 paper titled "The Procession Myth," a controversial dismissal of Edivane's life's work, but more damning was the letter they found attached to a recent university funding grant, dated just a month before Edivane's death. Held had written, "Should the Hipparchus fragment prove authentic and contradict the angular constants I propose, it would undermine 3 decades of research. The matter must be settled decisively before any public release." It was motive distilled, fear of ruin disguised as scholarly rigor. They returned to St. Cyprian's unannounced. Harriet asked only one question: "Where were you between 11 and 1 on the night of Edivane's death?" Held sighed. "Too quickly. In my office, reviewing data." "There was a second man at Gorswell Terrace that night," she said. "Seen watching the house. He had blonde hair, like you." He smiled thinly. "This is circumstantial. Your entire career depended on discrediting Edivane. The moment he confirmed the chart's truth, your theories collapsed. You're grasping. But the illusion, that was the real weapon. Not fear, but doubt. You knew he was fragile. You watched the trick. You saw the moment he broke." Held's silence stretched thin. Harriet moved closer. "Edivane died of a stopped heart. No poison, no struggle, no wound. You didn't kill him with force. You killed him with certainty." He looked away, then back with a quiet fury. "He was going to destroy everything I'd built. For a scrap of vellum and a telescope swim, you tampered with the wall," she said. "You removed the window days before, let Fenwick believe it was intact, and then you watched, not to witness a death, but a triumph. He didn't deny it." Merivale stepped forward. "We'll need you to come with us, outside." The first thunder growled across the sky. Harriet stood alone in the study, staring at the place where a window should have been, a view denied, a truth stolen. But in the end, it had all come into focus. Through glass or illusion, the light always finds a way in. The rain arrived at last, soft at first, then steady and ceaseless. Washing the heat from the cobblestones outside Gorswell Terrace, it pattered against the roofs of Bloomsbury, blurred the outlines of lampposts, and turned the alleys to ribbons of gray and silver. Inside the yard, Inspector Merivale leaned back in his chair, a folder spread before him and a look of resolution across his face. Professor Held sat in an interview room 1 floor below. Silent since his formal charge. Seems clean, doesn't it? Merivale said, tapping the folder. Held feared discredit. He tampered with the room, staged the illusion, watched Edivane die without lifting a hand. We've got the motive, opportunity, and a damning letter in his own hand. Harriet. Vane stood at the window, watching the rain run in crooked lines down the glass. To clean, she said. Merivale gave a short laugh. Now that's a phrase I've come to dread. No fingerprints on the telescope. No traces of Held inside the study. No proof he removed the window panel himself. Everything that places him there relies on Fenwick's word. And Fenwick, frankly, will say anything under pressure. We can still build a case. Of course, Harriet said, turning. But should we? Merivale closed the file, slowly. You think someone's counting on us to stop here? Harriet nodded. Held is arrogant enough to write his own condemnation. Yes, but the timing bothers me. Edivane's health wasn't poor, no sign of medication or cardiac concerns. The man dies within seconds of the illusion, but the illusion was already losing effect. When he collapsed, it doesn't match. And what would? Something more subtle, or something more personal. She tapped her notebook. What if Held was a diversion? A motive gift trapped in academic rivalry? Then who's the real puppeteer? Let's visit Tris Leving again. They found her in a flat above an antiquarian bookshop on Cecil Court, barefoot and pale, wearing a silk dressing gown that looked barely touched by sleep. Her mood was different, less defensive, more wary. I've already spoken to you both, she said as Harriet and Merivale stepped into the flat. And to your forensic team. I'm not sure what else you expect to find. A question, Harriet said. Did you know Professor Held personally? Barely. Met him once at a lecture. Thought him a bore. But you worked closely with Edivane, yes, until he became paranoid. Secretive. He stopped sharing notes, locked the chart away. Barely spoke to anyone, even I didn't know where. He was living until a few weeks before he died. Yet you arranged for Fenwick to be there that night. Tris paused, then poured herself a glass of water. He owed me a favor. I asked him to perform a minor trick, enough to make Edivane reconsider his solitude. Why? Harriet asked quietly. She looked over. Because I cared. He was brilliant, but slipping. I thought a scare might knock him back into reality. Harriet didn't respond. Immediately, she was watching Tris's hands steady to steady. You said you didn't know where he lived, but you addressed a letter to him at Gorswell Terrace 2 weeks before the death. We found it among his unopened post. Tris's eyes widened, but only for a moment. He must have given me the address before he withdrew. I forget. You don't forget where you send desperate letters, Miss Leving. You were in closer contact with him than you claimed. You knew more about his research than anyone. A sharp edge crept into Tris's tone. What are you accusing me of? Harriet stepped forward. I'm accusing you of manipulating this investigation to point toward Held. You exploited his rivalry with Edivane. Used Fenwick to stage a trick, but the real weapon was information. You knew exactly what would terrify Edivane. You just needed to time it perfectly. I didn't poison him. You said there was no poison. There wasn't. Harriet agreed. But the desk drawer contained crushed remains of a rare South American plant, mucuna. It induces panic, hallucinations, cardiac spasms in concentrated doses. A powdered extract was mixed with the glue on the drawer handle. Edivane always opened that drawer before working. Tris laughed, but it was hollow. That's absurd. Where would I even get such a thing? From Professor Held's lab, Harriet replied. The same place you visited under the guise of a university exhibition. 3 days before Edivane's death, there are records. Merivale stepped forward, voice low. We also know you arranged for Fenwick to be paid through an untraceable theater fund you administered. You thought every step through, Miss Leving, the false window, the plant extract, the rivalry withheld, a perfect storm, and now the case appears solved and you walk away. There was a long silence. Then Tris set her glass down with careful precision. You'll never prove intent. It'll look like manslaughter at most, perhaps, Harriet said, but the truth tends to peel its way to the surface, piece by piece. As they left the flat, the rain had begun to ease. Merivale lit a cigarette beneath the awning and blew smoke into the quiet street. So, he said, we have held in custody all the press eager to print a confession, and yet the real killer is out on bail. She won't stay free long. Harriet replied, something about her performance will crack. It always does. Merivale looked at her. You don't think she wanted him dead from the start, do you? I think she wanted him afraid. Harriet said, eyes distant. But when fear didn't bring him back, she reached for something sharper. And in the room once filled with stars, the missing window continued to gaze upon nothing, bearing silent witness to a death that had never truly been seen, only orchestrated. From behind a pane of glass that was never there at all, Harriet Vane found herself standing once again in the empty study of Dr. Felix Edivane. The room now, bare of illusion, devoid of presence, and eerily stripped of the fear that had once pulsed through its walls. The false window had been removed, the telescope impounded, and the worn red carpet still bore the ghost of his collapsed figure. Yet something was still missing, not a piece of evidence, but a sense of clarity, a thread yet tugged. She crouched beside the desk, running her fingers along the grain of the wood. Her thoughts drifted not to Tris Leving or Professor Held, but to the drawer, specifically the label affixed just beneath it, now slightly torn. It bore the faint imprint of a university cataloging code, one she'd seen before. She returned to her rooms with that scrap of memory clawing at her. She rummaged through her files, ignoring the clock, the distant rumble of the city settling into night. A thin folder, long forgotten, caught her attention. The Mitford lecture incident, dated 1928. A minor scandal at the time. An academic accused of manipulating experimental results in a demonstration involving sensory illusion and plant-based stimulants. The report had seemed unrelated then, discarded as one of many Cambridge quarrels. But Harriet now reread the name of the accused, Professor Harold Blackmore, no longer living, and his assistant at the time, Teresa Leving. She read aloud, not Tris. Teresa. The lie she'd told wasn't just one of omission. It was a complete reinvention. Morning found Harriet in the Records office of King's College, dry-mouthed and impatient. She pulled the personnel files, cross-referencing research assistants and the chemistry departments of the 1920s. There it was again, Teresa Leving, research assistant to Blackmore from 1926 to 1929, dismissed for academic impropriety after the Mitford scandal, vanished from the record after that, until she reemerged 10 years later, with a new academic persona, supporting young minds in illusion and stagecraft. The shift wasn't coincidence, it was camouflage. Harriet found Inspector Merivale in the Yard's archive room, nursing lukewarm coffee and blinking through paper fog. I need you to hear something, she said without preamble, placing the Mitford file on his desk. This wasn't her first foray into deception. He read silently, brow furrowing deeper with each page. So Teresa has a history of this, hallucinogenic substances, psychological manipulation. She learned from Blackmore. And more than that, she was publicly disgraced. Her name struck from formal records, Edivane, however, testified in favor of Blackmore. And when the professor was removed, Edivane inherited the research grant. Merivale whistled under his breath. That's more than motive. That's a grudge to decades deep. It explains her obsession, her attempts to collaborate, then coerce. Edivane took everything from her: her position, her mentor's legacy, her future in academic science. What she did to him wasn't about rivalry, it was vengeance, cultivated slowly and executed with surgical precision. But how did she track him down after all this time? Harriet tapped the photograph from the Mitford file, Blackmore's, Last public lecture. In the corner, almost out of frame, stood a young Edivane and an equally young Teresa Leving side by side. She never lost sight of him, just waited for her moment, and held. Collateral, a red herring with a believable motive. She nudged him into correspondence, even sent falsified notes to his lab under Edivane's name. Built an entire narrative around a feud that served her plan perfectly. Merivale sat back, rubbing his temple. We charged the wrong person. No, Harriet said. We followed the right clues, just not deep enough. Now we know the truth. We can act, but we must move carefully. If she suspects we've uncovered her past, she'll vanish before we can act. Merivale finished, but they were already too late. By the time they reached the bookshop, flat on Cecil Court, the rooms had been emptied, drawers pulled, papers burned in a small ceramic basin. The air still carried the trace of incense and scorched paper. A single note sat folded on the desk, addressed simply, to those who believe. In justice to late. Harriet opened it without a word. You cannot steal from someone the world has already forgotten. You cannot murder what was already buried. I gave Edivane a chance to make amends. He refused. This is not regret. This is equilibrium. Beneath the signature, only the initials, T.L. Harriet passed the note silently to Merivale. He read it with pursed lips, then said grimly, "She's gone. Not far." Harriet murmured, "This isn't over. People like her don't run, they reinvent." She turned to the open window, the soft morning light brushing the buildings outside, and her thoughts wound backward through the tangled history of a forgotten academic scandal, a stolen future, and a crime committed not for money or impulse but for restoration of dignity. She saw now that the death of Dr. Felix Edivane had been written not in rage, but in patience, and somewhere, behind another mask, Teresa Leving was already weaving her next illusion. The sun filtered through the gray veil of London's clouds the following afternoon, casting thin slants of light across Harriet Vane's writing table. A dozen photographs lay spread before her: publicity stills, lecture pamphlets, group photos from academic conferences, all linked by one common thread: Teresa Leving. Hidden in plain sight beneath a variety of names, hairstyles, and affiliations. She had been clever, Harriet admitted, painstaking in her reinvention, but not flawless. It was the small things that gave her away: a particular brooch she always wore on her lapel, a posture leaning ever so slightly to the left, even a preference for teal-colored garments. Most people might not have noticed, but Harriet was not most people. She lit a cigarette and leaned back in her chair. Running would require resources, safe houses, contacts. Teresa had avoided prison once. She wouldn't make the mistake of staying in London unless she had something left to finish, and Harriet suspected she did. By evening, she found herself back at Gorswell Terrace. The room had been cleaned since the investigation, but something about it still held the shape of Teresa's presence. The study had become less a crime scene and more a portrait of control, of manipulation, of a mind far more calculating than anyone had anticipated. She stood near the empty window frame. The wind stirred her hair as she considered what remained unsaid. Teresa had orchestrated every detail with such surgical precision, which made the note she left behind feel oddly impulsive. The phrasing, "This is not regret, this is equilibrium." It was too polished for a woman fleeing justice. No, Harriet thought, it was meant to be read again, picked apart. It was bait. Back at her flat, she opened a new file and reviewed Teresa's published work under her known aliases. One caught her eye: the illusion of pattern recognition. Why the Mind Invents Motives, a monograph, self-published. The title struck her. Teresa was warning them, even as she played her part in the deception. Harriet smiled grimly. She needed to draw Teresa out, but brute force wouldn't work, nor would surveillance. Teresa lived in performance. She thrived on orchestrating the responses of others. If Harriet wanted answers, she'd have to set the stage herself. The next day, a modest announcement appeared in the Times academic column: the Gorswell Lecture Series will continue in memoriam, with a special evening led by Dr. Ambrose Hallam, presenting previously unseen notes by the late Dr. Felix Edivane. The name was invented. The notes were a ruse, but the lecture hall was reland. Harriet knew Teresa would read the notice. Pride would demand it. 3 days later, The hall was dimly lit. Rows of worn seats ranged before a small platform where a single object stood, the false window, reconstructed in all its eerie glory, now part of an interactive demonstration. A crowd of 30 academic attendees murmured in the shadows, but Harriet had eyes only for the slim woman near the back, scarf drawn high and sunglasses resting casually on her brow. Teresa was watching. Harriet took the stage. "Before we begin," she said, voice smooth, a word about perception. "Our minds see what they expect to see, but sometimes with the right catalyst, they reveal far more." She gestured toward the window. This illusion once fooled a brilliant man. But what truly broke him wasn't the image, it was what the illusion didn't show. Something missing. She paused. Fear doesn't come from what's visible. It comes from what the mind fills in. She stepped aside. "We've modified the device. If you'd like to view it, I invite you one at a time." The crowd shuffled forward, tentative. But Harriet wasn't watching them. She was watching Teresa. And sure enough, just as the final volunteer stepped back, Teresa moved forward, hands tucked in her coat pockets, expression unreadable. Harriet greeted her with a nod. "Would you care to try, Miss Leving?" Teresa met her gaze. "You've made it into theater now." "It was always theater," Harriet said softly. "That's what made it so dangerous." Teresa stepped up to the window. The illusion flickered to life, streetlights where none existed, an open world beyond a closed wall. But Harriet had added something more, projected faintly, visible only to the viewer and only from a certain angle, was an image taken from Blackmore's final lecture, the one where Edivane and Teresa stood side by side, young and naive. Before betrayal and bitterness bloomed, Teresa stared. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. But Harriet saw it, the smallest shift in posture, the tightening of her shoulders, a subtle movement of her hands almost to her throat. Then halted mid-gesture. She stepped away with measured grace. But her eyes flicked to Harriet with something colder than fear, acknowledgement. "I trust. Your demonstration will be published," she said evenly. "Eventually," Harriet replied. "When the story is complete." Teresa turned and vanished into the crowd. Later, in the empty hall, Merivale joined Harriet by the platform. "That was risky." She didn't confess, no. But she cracked. Harriet nodded. "I didn't need her to fall apart, just to react. Now I know where to look next." That photo? It was archived in a university library in Florence. Blackmore's estate. Merivale's eyebrows lifted. "You think she'll go there?" She left fingerprints, emotional ones. The illusion was meant to deceive Edivane, but it mirrored something far more personal. Something she hadn't confronted. Her past. Harriet touched the frame of the false window. "We all invent motives, but some of us live inside them." The illusion winked out, and the room fell into silence. Yet in that quiet, Harriet heard the echo of a pursuit not yet finished, a game still in motion. And she, for the first time, saw the path forward, not through evidence, but through the human mind at war with its own history. Teresa Leving was brilliant, yes, but not invincible, and Harriet Vane had just found her flaw. The Florence rain fell in a thin, misting sheet as Harriet Vane stepped into the vaulted reading room of the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana. The ceiling soared above her like a cathedral, the hush broken only by the soft shuffling of scholars and the distant hum of rolling carts. She adjusted her scarf, water beating at its hem, and presented the letter of access that Merivale had arranged. The librarian, a tall, narrow man with an expression that hinted at disapproval of modern humanity, gave a curt nod and led her to a long mahogany table set near the back, away from the main flow of visitors. Here, the Blackmore archive had been partially catalogued, purchased posthumously by the university during the dissolution of Edivane's estate. The box she requested was brought out after 15 minutes, slim, numbered 17B, sealed with a red thread and bearing the signature of an archivist who, according to her notes, had retired 3 years ago. She broke the seal gently. Inside were fragments, old letters, research diagrams, a few photographs clipped together with rusted paper pins. She found the lecture photo she'd used in the illusion, confirming its provenance. But there was another she hadn't seen before. Teresa standing in front of a coastal institute in Trieste, arm hooked around Edivane's. It was the expression on her face that froze Harriet mid-breath. Not warmth, not affection, anticipation. Teresa was already planning something. Even then, she set the photo aside carefully and continued, pages crackling under gloved fingers. Then she found a transcript, labeled Scripta Privata, Blackmore's final notes on the Illusion Project. Handwritten, incomplete. He'd scrawled a line in the margin. If she sees this, she'll know I knew. Harriet reached for her pen to make a light annotation and froze. Something was wrong. The edge of the page was too clean, the ink too sharp. She held it to the light. The sheet had been replaced. She quickly sifted through the rest. 3 diagrams bore similar replacements, identical in content, but subtly newer paper stock. A forgery. Someone had been here already. She checked the archive log. Last accessed, a month ago, by a visiting scholar under the name Dr. Petra Loring. There was no such name in the academic registers. Teresa again. And this time, she wasn't just hiding, she was rewriting history. Harriet rose, taking only her notes. She didn't trust the copies to remain there much longer. That evening, back at her hotel, she arranged a call to Merivale through a secure line. She's tampered with the archive, she said without preamble. Replaced 3 pages left. Just enough truth to keep it plausible. But the key phrase from Blackmore's notes is gone. Someone's helping her. Who? Someone with archival access. Or someone skilled enough to forge credentials and dodge suspicion. Either way, this isn't a solo act anymore. You think she's cleaning house? Merivale asked. I think she's trying to buy time. Or worse, trying to erase the only part of Blackmore's writing that could link her to his collapse. There was a pause. You should come back, he said, before something happens. Harriet hesitated. Not yet. She's desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. But the next morning, when she returned to the library with a request to review the same box, the response chilled her. Box 17B, the new librarian asked. Flipping through the log, it was destroyed. Harriet blinked. Destroyed? Yes, last night. Sprinkler malfunction in the northern wing. Several boxes affected. But this isn't the northern wing. A faint shrug. The damage was unpredictable. She asked to speak to the archivist in charge. After much back and forth, a gray-haired woman in a wear-upon shawl appeared, apologetic but firm. The fire alarm had gone off at 2 a.m. They were still assessing the extent of the loss. Yes, it was unfortunate. No, backups weren't complete. Harriet left the library in silence, heart hammering. She walked fast, ducking through narrow streets toward the cafe where she'd left her briefcase, under the watchful eye of a trusted contact. As she sat down, something tickled at the edge of her mind. The photo. She opened her notebook. The photograph from Trieste was gone. Not stolen from the archive, stolen from her case. Someone had slipped into her hotel, or perhaps followed her to the cafe and lifted it while she was inside the library. Not just destruction, surveillance. Teresa, or someone acting for her, was watching every move. She called Merivale again. The photo's gone, she said, and they burned the evidence. Merivale's voice tightened. You're pulling out. Now, no, I need to know what they're trying so hard to hide. This isn't just about the illusion anymore. Something deeper is being buried. Harriet stared into her coffee, thoughts racing. What if Blackmore had discovered not just Teresa's manipulation, but a broader pattern, something she was using the illusion to test or mask? The early project had military interest, psychological conditioning, controlled perception. What if the illusion wasn't the experiment? What if it was the cover? The photo Trieste held meaning beyond nostalgia. A facility, a test site, something they'd done together. Something Edivane had tried to expose before being silenced by madness. And now the evidence was vanishing piece by piece. Someone racing her toward the finish line with a lit match in one hand and the truth smothered in the other. She looked up sharply as the door to the cafe swung open and a man stepped in, balding, wire-rimmed glasses. Familiar in the way a shadow is familiar just before nightfall. He looked directly at her, paused, then walked back out. She gathered her things quickly and left by the back entrance, heart in her throat. Teresa wasn't afraid of exposure anymore. She was afraid of what might still remain, hidden, undestroyed, a detail overlooked. And now Harriet had to find it before it disappeared forever. The narrow alley behind the cafe led to a tangle of uneven cobblestones and shuttered shop fronts, still slick with last night's rain. Harriet kept to the shadows, her pulse quickening. The man with the wire-rimmed glasses hadn't followed, but his expression had held something unmistakable recognition. He wasn't just watching. He knew who she was, and he wanted her to know it. She turned the corner sharply and ducked into a tobacco shop, lingering near the back shelves. After several minutes passed in quiet, she exhaled and slipped out through the side door. A cab waited at the far end of the street. She waved it down and gave an address at random: a church she had passed once in the Oltrarno district. Inside the cab, her fingers trembled slightly as she sent Merivale a coded message. They needed to accelerate the timeline. Someone had burned the archive. Someone had lifted the photo. And someone else, perhaps the same, was circling her now. She was being pushed off balance, and that meant only one thing: the truth was dangerously close. The church provided sanctuary for the next hour. A heavy frescoed silence, marble saints that stared without judgment. Harriet sat alone in a pew, mentally retracing each clue, each connection. The traced photograph, the vanished archive, the name Petra Loring. A pattern was beginning to take form, but then her phone buzzed. Unknown number, no message. Then again and again. She hesitated, then answered on the fourth ring. There was a pause, then a soft, static-laced voice. "Go to the bridge," it said. "The Pont della Carraia. Come alone. You'll find what she doesn't want you to see." The line went dead. The bridge sat low and stone-built across the Arno, less tourist-choked than its famous cousins. As dusk descended over Florence, the lamps cast blurred reflections in the water. Harriet arrived just past 7, alone. The foot traffic was sparse, locals mostly. An old man with a dog, a cyclist, a pair of students laughing under their breath. Then, at the far end of the bridge, something caught her eye. A small envelope, sealed in wax, wedged behind the balustrade under a loose brick. She pried it free and checked for anyone watching. No one seemed to notice. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, the kind hardly used anymore. It showed the man with wire-rimmed glasses standing inside what looked like a storage room. Behind him, clear as day, was the missing photo of Teresa and Edivane, pinned to a corkboard. He was holding a notebook, open, displaying something written in bold black ink. Not her first. A sick weight dropped into Harriet's stomach. Not her first. She turned the envelope over. Another slip of paper fell out. Coordinates, just outside Florence, accompanied by a time: tonight, 11:15 p.m. Harriet didn't wait. She returned to her hotel, grabbed her go bag, and booked a car under an alias. She made the drive with growing tension. The location was a dilapidated villa, half swallowed by olive groves and encircled by wrought iron fencing. From a distance, it looked long abandoned, boarded windows, cracked tiles, ivy-choked gates. But as she neared the main path, a single light flickered in a back corner room. She parked under the tree line and approached on foot. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was damp with mildew and dust, but footprints marred the grime on the floor, recent, heavy. She followed them slowly, flashlight off, phone recording, up a creaking stairwell, across a narrow landing, to the door where light seeped through the gap beneath. She pushed it open. The man from the cafe stood hunched over a desk. Maps, files, and photographs littered the surface. He looked up sharply but didn't move to run. "Too late," he said. She was here already. Harriet scanned the room. Documents torn, files missing, but some remained. She stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" she asked. He hesitated. "Jacobi. I worked with Blackmore long ago, before the Illusion Project became corrupted by her." Jacobi nodded once. Teresa didn't invent the idea, but she refined it, weaponized it. The Treece tests were the first. Blackmore discovered what she'd done, manipulating memory, emotion. The illusion wasn't about perception, it was about control. He handed Harriet a photograph, grainy, black and white, a body, charred, incomplete, Test. Subject, he said quietly. That one didn't survive. Harriet's skin prickled. What does this have to do with the murders now? She asked. Jacoby swallowed. Teresa's erasing everyone who knew. I was next. But you've become a problem. He reached behind him, and before Harriet could react, the lights cut out. In the darkness, glass shattered. A scream. She ducked low, heart pounding, pulling a small flashlight from her coat. She scanned the floor. Jacoby was down. Blood pooled beneath his head. A single gunshot. No sign of the shooter. But on the desk was a drive still plugged in, still warm. She snatched it. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had tipped them off. She fled down the back stairs and into the grove, headlights rising behind her as the villa lit up in blue and red. She ran without looking back. Back in Florence an hour later, hidden in a borrowed flat. Harriet played the files. Photos, transcripts, video logs. One name kept recurring. Teresa Edivane. And then another. Clara Blackmore, Blackmore's sister, reported missing in 1993, but not dead. Harriet froze as the video played a clinical recording. Clara, hooked to wires. Teresa, watching, silent, unblinking. A knock sounded at the door. Harriet spun, drawing her phone, but there was no time. Another knock. Then the sound of the lock turning from the outside. Someone had the key. The lock clicked softly, the door creaked open, and Harriet's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the far wall, the glow from the laptop screen casting flickering shadows across her tense features, the silhouette that slipped. Inside was slim, deliberate, familiar, yet cloaked in uncertainty. Harriet, the voice said quietly, and she recognized it immediately. Inspector Moretti. Relief surged, but it was tempered by wariness. How much did he know? How much had he suspected all along? Thank God, she whispered. They're after me. Jacoby's dead. Moretti stepped inside, shutting the door carefully behind him. I came as soon as I heard. What do you have? She motioned toward the laptop. Files from the villa. Blackmore, Edivane, Clara. It's all connected. The Illusion Project isn't just about manipulation, it's about erasing people, erasing evidence. And the murders aren't random. They're cleaning up loose ends. Moretti crouched beside her, eyes scanning the screen. So who's pulling the strings? Harriet hesitated. That's what I'm trying to figure out. But something's been gnawing at me. The pattern. It's in the details no one noticed. She pulled up a series of photographs. The traced tests, the victim profiles, the suspect statements. Look here, she said, pointing at a seemingly innocuous object that recurred in several images. A silver pendant shaped like an eye. It appeared pinned to a bulletin board, tucked into a victim's hand, and even caught in the hair of a witness who'd insisted she knew nothing. Moretti frowned. A symbol, not just a symbol, a signature. Someone left it deliberately. But why? Harriet scrolled back to the interrogation transcripts. She reread a sentence from Clara Blackmore's cousin. A man named Silas. She always wore that eye pendant, said it watched over her. Suddenly, the misplaced, nearly overlooked object had weight. It connected the victims in a subtle web. The pendant wasn't just jewelry, it was a mark of belonging, or of warning. Then she remembered the peculiar reaction of Lydia Trent, the secretary, during questioning. When Harriet had mentioned the pendant, Lydia's composure faltered for a split second, a blink so fast most would miss. But not her. She's hiding something. Harriet muttered. Moretti nodded. And the pattern? Harriet leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. All the victims had the pendant or a connection to someone who did. The murders aren't just about silencing witnesses, they're about severing ties within a secret network. Her mind raced. Connecting dots formed from whispered names and cryptic references. The elusive Petra Loring wasn't just a name tossed offhandedly, it was the linchpin. The pendant was Petra's mark, a symbol for her clandestine group, one that controlled or manipulated people involved in the Illusion Project. Suddenly, the initial chaos, the vanishing evidence, the conflicting testimonies, the rushed accusations began to make sense. The true danger lay not in individual motives like jealousy or greed, but in the shadowy force that bound these people together, enforcing silence through fear and violence. Moretti broke the silence. So the key was the pendant all along. Harriet nodded. And that means Petra Loring is still out there, watching, pulling strings. The realization hit her hard. Every move they'd made so far played into a carefully constructed game. The criminals weren't just hiding, they were orchestrating. "We need to find Petra before she strikes again," Harriet said. Her voice steady despite the turmoil. Moretti agreed, already reaching for his phone. But Harriet's eyes caught something on the desk, a small scrap of paper folded neatly beneath the laptop. She unfolded it slowly. The message was simple, chilling. "You're looking at the wrong people. The eye sees all, but trusts none." She felt the weight of those words settle over the room like a dark fog. The case was deeper and more tangled than they had imagined. Yet within that cryptic warning lay a truth. The key had been in plain sight all along. Now, it was up to Harriet and Moretti to follow the thread where it led, through shadows and secrets, until the pattern was fully unraveled and the killer exposed. Moretti's knuckles whitened around the paper as he reread the message Harriet had found. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the temperature now. Harriet's mind ran circles around the implications. "You're looking at the wrong people. The eye sees all, but trusts none." It wasn't just a threat, it was a reorientation. A whispered suggestion that the real hand behind the curtain hadn't even entered the stage yet. Harriet leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, not to rest, but to sift through the noise. The pendant, Petra Loring, the altered records, a second murder, planted evidence. Everything had been manipulated, guided. If the killer had so thoroughly distorted the picture, what was it they were desperate to hide? She opened her eyes slowly, staring at the screen still aglow with files from the Illusion Project. The term illusion was never metaphorical, it was literal. Not just a psychological game, but the very nature of the reality they'd been presented with. Project Illusion had begun as a psychological experiment in identity suppression. During war, a method of overriding a person's sense of self so completely that they could assume new identities, carry out missions, or be hidden in plain sight. But it had failed, or so the reports claimed. And yet, as Harriet dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Several of the original test subjects had died years ago, or so the records said. But the death certificates were vague. No autopsies, no burials attended by family, almost as if the deaths were convenient, expected, or staged. "What if," she whispered, "Project Illusion never failed? What if it worked too well?" Moretti turned sharply. "You think someone from the project used it, became someone else entirely, not just used it," she said, fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up identity logs, timestamps, video feeds. "I think they are someone else, living under a false identity. Maybe one of our witnesses, maybe one of our suspects." She stopped, her breath hitched. Lydia Trent. She had appeared harmless, mousy, hesitant, eager to please. But she had also shown flashes of something else. Precision, composure under stress. A moment during questioning when Harriet had accused Clara of involvement, and Lydia had tensed, not in surprise or horror, but as if the script had gone off course. Harriet opened the personnel file on Lydia. There it was. An entry gap in her employment history between 2013 and 2016. The years Project Illusion had run its final covert trials in southern France. She'd later reappeared in London under a slightly modified name, Lydia Trant. Only a few records connected the dots. A false identity. She turned to Moretti. "We've been looking for Petra Loring as a shadow, a manipulator, but what if she was already in the room? What if Lydia is Petra Loring?" Moretti looked stunned. "But why go through all this trouble? Why kill? Why manipulate so many?" Harriet's eyes darkened. "Because it wasn't about covering up a failed experiment. It was about ensuring it lived on undetected. Lydia Petra used Project Illusion to disappear from one life and build another, one where she could test, expand, and control. She wasn't just hiding, she was evolving. The real motive was no longer money or revenge. It was obsession, control over perception itself. Petra had sacrificed her identity, her past, and the lives of others to prove one thing, that she could make the world see what she wanted it to see. She had created murder not out of necessity, but to test how deeply she could manipulate truth and memory, and she had nearly succeeded. Harriet's hand trembled slightly as she printed out the Falsified documents, one for Lydia Trent, another for Petra Loring. The bone structure, even the handwriting samples in archives, aligned more than coincidence would allow. The final proof came from a line in the original project notes, signed by Loring herself. In the end, the most perfect illusion is the one where no one even suspects they're looking at one. Moretti let out a low whistle. She buried herself in plain sight and killed anyone who looked too closely, Harriet added grimly. Clara knew something. Jacobi uncovered the pendant link. Even Edivane's death fits. He was close to recognizing her. The final puzzle piece settled into place. Petra Loring wasn't just erasing the past, she was proving that the past could be rewritten. And in doing so, she had orchestrated murders, constructed identities, and watched investigators stumble through illusions she had laid like breadcrumbs. But the mask had cracked. Harriet had seen through it, not because of some dramatic clue or burst of violence, but because of Petra's own need to be admired, even from behind the veil. The pendant, the carefully left messages, they weren't warnings. They were breadcrumbs, left by a narcissist desperate to be understood, if not recognized. Harriet stood. We go to Lydia now, before she writes the next chapter. Moretti nodded, already reaching for his coat. The storm that had raged for days outside had finally broken, and the wind against the windows now felt less like nature and more like breath. The breath of someone watching, always watching, from behind. The eyes that never closed. Petra Loring, illusionist, murderer, and puppet master, had built her reality on silence and shadows. And now, the truth was coming to light. Harriet stood in the silent corridor outside Lydia Trent's flat, listening. No movement from within. Not even the rustle of curtains or the groan of old floorboards. Just the quiet hum of electricity and the beating of her own pulse in her ears. She glanced at Moretti, who gave her a curt nod. The warrant was in hand. The pieces were aligned. It was time. With a firm rap on the door, Harriet called out, "Miss Trent, we need to speak with you." "It won't take long." Silence. Then, faintly, the scrape of a chair leg. A breath. She was inside. Waiting. Moretti's hand dropped to his sidearm, but Harriet lifted a hand. No drama. Her voice was low. "She wants to control this. We don't give her chaos." Harriet stepped back as the door clicked open. Lydia stood in the threshold, composed, hair tied neatly, expression unreadable. But there was a glint in her eye, sharp, cold, calculating, like someone who had already rehearsed this moment 100 times. "Detective," she said coolly, "I assume this is about the murders. We'd like to come in," Harriet said. Lydia stepped aside. The flat was unnervingly sterile. Books aligned by size and spine color. No dust on the shelves, no photographs, no clutter. Nothing personal, not even a coffee cup left half drunk. Harriet's eyes roamed the space. Everything too perfect, as if it belonged to someone who lived. As an idea, not a person. "You've been playing a long game," Harriet said, turning to face her. "Petra," Lydia's smile faltered, "not for long." Just the faintest tremor of her lips before she composed herself again. "Petra's dead." She replied, "No," Harriet said. "Petra Loring erased herself. You killed Clara because she got too close. You killed Jacobi because he knew the pendant's origin. You planted evidence, created false leads, and you did it all because you needed to prove it worked, that you could become someone else, that you could rewrite reality." Lydia's eyes flicked to the mantelware. Now that Harriet noticed, a small recording device blinked softly in standby mode. "You're recording this?" Harriet asked. Lydia walked to it and clicked it off. "Habit," she said. "No," Harriet corrected. "Control." Moretti's voice cut in. "You've fooled almost everyone." But the inconsistencies caught up. The pendant, the records from the project, the handwriting match, the alias history. "You should have destroyed the old life entirely." Lydia's expression finally cracked. "But then who would I be?" she asked quietly. "If I destroyed her completely, I'd just be no one." Harriet approached slowly. "You wanted Petra Loring to be remembered, not for what she did, but for what she created. Project Illusion was never about suppression. It was about transcendence." Lydia met her gaze. "It worked," she whispered. "I became her, the perfect second self." I watched you all walk in circles, chasing ghosts I laid out like breadcrumbs. Clara was sloppy. She remembered too much. Jacobi had the right instincts, wrong priorities. But you underestimated me, Harriet said softly. Because I watched you watch us. Lydia tilted her head. And now what? You arrest me? Charge me with a murder the justice system won't understand? You think the courts will comprehend what I am? Harriet didn't move. I don't care if they do. I only care that you're stopped. There was a flicker, a twitch in Lydia's right hand. Don't, Harriet warned. Too late. Lydia lunged not toward Harriet, but toward a panel near the kitchen. Moretti moved fast, slamming her into the wall, pinning her wrist before her fingers could reach the hidden switch embedded behind the tiles. A quick search revealed a narrow compartment with a burner phone, passport, and a syringe, contents unknown. You had a failsafe, Moretti said. Lydia's breathing was shallow now, not from fear, from exhilaration. You think this is the end, she said, voice rising. But it's not. Illusion doesn't die, it adapts. Harriet stepped in, lowering herself to eye level with her. Illusion might survive, she said, but you won't, for the first time. Lydia's expression broke completely. Anger, desperation, disbelief. You don't understand what I've done. I rewrote reality. Harriet shook her head. No. You ran from it. Moretti cuffed her. As they led her out of the flat, Lydia's shoulders stiffened. But she said nothing. She had lost the script, and there was no understudy waiting to take her place. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the London clouds. For the first time in days, the light felt honest. Harriet remained on the steps, watching as the car drove off. The case was closed, but not cleanly. Petra had revealed something deeper about identity, about perception, about how far someone would go to be seen the way they chose. Behind her, the door to the flat still hung open. No furniture would ever fill that place with warmth. No real person had ever lived there. Only an illusion, one that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own performance. The rain had begun again, London's slow, relentless drizzle painting the streets in reflective gray. Harriet stood at her office window, watching the blur of umbrellas pass like insects beneath her gaze. Lydia Trent, or rather Petra Loring, was behind bars. The statements were filed. The press had their headline. The commissioner had even sent flowers, and yet a small unease gnawed at the edge of Harriet's mind. It wasn't relief she felt. It was stillness. Too much stillness. The illusion had been dismantled. Yes, but something didn't add up. She reviewed the details compulsively. The way Petra had avoided questions about her time in the institute, the smug certainty in her tone even when caught, and the strange confidence she displayed in those final moments, as if she believed something crucial remained hidden. The pendant, that damn pendant. It had been recovered in Jacobi's drawer, but Harriet hadn't yet deciphered the final inscription, an odd second engraving, too faint to read by eye. She now slid it from the evidence envelope and held it beneath her desk lamp. In a sudden impulse, she fetched a magnifying glass and began examining the worn surface again. Not initials, not a date, a name, A. Winterbourne. Harriet's brow furrowed. She didn't recognize it. She pulled up the Institute's archived staff lists. No Winterbourne. No matches in the Petra Loring file either. Then she checked something deeper. Earlier case files linked to the Illusion Project. Not just the public reports, but the internal memos she had obtained quietly from Moretti's contact at Intelligence Oversight. And there it was. Dr. Alaric Winterbourne, Project Oversight Officer. Dismissed quietly before Petra's final phase began. No explanation, no inquiry. He simply vanished. Harriet's fingers moved quickly now, tracing funding logs and correspondence. Lydia Petra had mentioned a missing half. At the time, Harriet had assumed it was metaphorical. A part of herself Petra claimed she'd severed. But what if it wasn't? What if Petra wasn't the architect of this illusion at all? Harriet checked the name again, ran it through public databases. No address, no employment history after 2016, but a single match, a purchase order, made under a company shell, for biometric recording software. Paid in cash. The delivery address was a small town outside Bath. She grabbed her coat. 2 hours later, Her car pulled up to a derelict farmhouse on the edge of a wooded hill. The air was thick with damp, the road slick with old mud. No lights showed from the windows. But as she approached, she saw something strange beneath the barn door, a faint bluish glow, like the flicker of a monitor left on in sleep mode. She slipped inside. The barn had been converted crudely, but effectively into a surveillance suite. Screens lined one wall, displaying paused footage of Petra's flat, Clara's kitchen, Jacoby's office, and chillingly Harriet's own precinct. The timestamp on one screen was from just 3 days ago. "You've come further than I thought." The voice was calm, male, and maddeningly familiar. Harriet turned slowly. Dr. Alaric Winterbourne stepped from the shadows, thinner than the photo, older now, with silver hair and pale eyes that gave nothing away. He wore no disguise, no defense, just resignation and the kind of arrogance born from thinking oneself untouchable. "You were behind it all," Harriet said. "I designed the program," he replied. "Petra was just the prototype. A brilliant one, yes, but unstable." She began improvising. The murders, the message in the pendant, that was her performance. "But I wrote the script." "You abandoned the project." "I vanished from the paperwork." Winterbourne corrected. "Not the project." Harriet scanned the room. "You watched us all." "I had to." Petra was only the beginning. Illusion isn't just a system, it's a mirror. Everyone reflects what they want to be seen as. My job was to record it. "And who were you showing it to?" Winterbourne smiled faintly. "That's the wrong question." He moved to a panel on the far wall and lifted a plastic tarp. Beneath it, rows of labeled drives, each marked with initials and codes. Harriet saw her own HD, CN for 581. "You've been recording me. You've been part of it since day one." "Detective," he said. "You just didn't know." Harriet took a step forward. "Why? For what purpose?" "To test integrity," he said. "To push people to their ethical limits. To see who breaks and who bends." Petra failed. Clara cracked. "But you, Harriet, you kept going." She stared at him, heart hammering. "Do you know what that makes you?" He asked softly. "The control subject, the final variable. You were never investigating Petra. You were completing my experiment." She said nothing, just stared. "But now," he added, "I've learned enough." He pressed a switch. A low whine began the surge of a timed ignition. Harriet saw it immediately. Beneath the floorboards, the faint hiss of gas. He was going to burn it. She lunged, tackling him hard. Across the room, his hand smashed into the side wall, the timer jolting off by seconds. He struggled, but she pinned him with her knee, wrenching a pair of cuffs from her belt and locking his wrists behind his back. "You don't get to erase this," she snapped. Winterbourne was breathing hard, still smiling faintly. "You'll never make them believe you." She rose, grabbing one of the drives and pocketing it. "They don't have to believe everything, just enough to lock you away." Behind her, the timer crackled. She yanked the ignition wires loose. The hum died. Later, as officers flooded the scene and Winterbourne was taken into custody, Harriet stood beneath the rising dawn. The air was colder now, cleaner. She had closed the Petra case, but she had opened something darker, something systemic, layered, and dangerously close to invisible. The illusion had always been about more than one woman. It had been about everyone. The courtroom was packed, press officials and quiet observers drawn in by whispers of the scandal that had stretched from a single murder into the dark underbelly of a forgotten government project. Dr. Alaric Winterbourne sat in the dock, hands folded neatly, an expression of boredom thinly veiling calculation. Harriet Crane sat to rows behind the prosecution bench, silent and unreadable. Her eyes trained not on Winterbourne, but on the judge. The prosecution laid out the timeline with clinical precision. How Winterbourne had initiated Project Illusion, faked his disappearance, and manipulated Petra Loring into acting out his twisted hypothesis in the real world. The surveillance footage, the biometric data, the recovered pendant, each thread meticulously connected. Winterbourne's lawyers raised objections, citing lack of motive, theoretical intent, and Petra's own autonomy. But it was clear, at least to the jury, that Winterbourne hadn't just observed the chaos, he had orchestrated it. Still, something gnawed at Harriet's sense of closure when she took the stand. She did so not to recap the obvious, but to explain what hadn't been seen, the faint details that had led her down the right path when others had been misled. The pendant Petra carried wasn't just a keepsake, Harriet said, holding up a replica. It was a signature, Winterbourne's way of marking her, but it also bore his name in micro-engraving, a detail only visible under magnification, a clue he didn't expect anyone to find. That mistake was the beginning of his unraveling. She walked the court through the shifts in Petra's behavior, her allusions to being half of a mirror, and how her performance only made sense once you realized she'd been trained not for deception, but for obedience. She thought she was outsmarting us, but in truth, she was carrying out instructions planted years earlier. The silence that followed was thick. Outside, the verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Multiple counts of conspiracy, unlawful surveillance, psychological manipulation, and obstruction of justice. The sentencing was deferred, pending psychiatric evaluation, but the judge made it clear Winterbourne would not walk free. But Harriet wasn't convinced that was the end. 2 days later, a package arrived at her flat. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside, a small, black flash drive and a single note in precise block lettering. You missed the real experiment. She inserted the drive into a secure terminal. A series of folders appeared, each marked with a date and location. Inside, transcripts, videos, and observation logs, none related to Petra. All recent, some dated just weeks earlier. Subjects she didn't recognize, footage from across the country, a new trial group. Winterbourne had been running parallel tests. Petra wasn't the only prototype, just the first one that went rogue. Harriet leaned back in her chair. She had testified. She had won the conviction. She had dismantled the illusion, or so she thought. But the game wasn't over. Later that night, she met with Moretti on the embankment. They walked without speaking for a while, the river black and slow beside them. He planned for this, she finally said. Even prison was part of the design, a way to stay in the shadows while the rest played out. Moretti nodded. What do you want to do? Expose the rest, every name, every subject. He created a system to break people open and record the fragments. I want to burn that system to the ground. And what if some of them are already in power, embedded deep? Then we dig deeper. A long pause. Will you go public? He asked. Not yet. Truth needs more than evidence. It needs timing. They parted ways without saying goodbye. Back at her flat, Harriet sat at her desk again, the flash drive blinking slowly beside her. She opened the first file, labeled simply, Subject 07 Initial Deviation. As the footage began to play, her phone buzzed. It was a message, no number, just text. You were never outside the experiment, only closer to the center. Harriet stared at the words, then slowly turned the phone face down. Justice had been served, the court had declared. But deep in her bones, Harriet knew better. Winterbourne had been stopped but not silenced. And while he might be confined to a cell, the system he built still moved in shadows, evolving. Watching, learning, she exhaled quietly and picked up her notebook. One case was closed. A much larger one had just begun. Even with the courtroom's verdict etched in law, and the shadowy arc of Winterbourne's operation exposed, Harriet Crane found no comfort in the finality others insisted upon. The world around her moved on, headlines declaring justice served, officials posturing for cameras, Petra Loring buried in a psychiatric facility far from the public eye. But something within her wouldn't let go. She sat alone in her study. Late one evening, London's summer dusk bleeding orange against the window panes. The flash drive Winterbourne had sent still rested on the corner of her desk, now joined by a second, smaller one marked with nothing more than a single-digit -9. It had arrived that morning, slipped through her letterbox in an envelope without postage or seal. That in itself was unsettling enough. But what truly disturbed her was that the drive contained nothing. Empty folders, blank metadata. No videos, no text files, only a single embedded note, deep in the drive's codebase. That read, 9 truths, only one mattered. Which one did you choose? She couldn't make sense of it. Not yet. Harriet pushed back from the desk and crossed to the fireplace. There, above the mantel, hung a corkboard cluttered with pins and strings, a lattice of images, names, incident reports, and symbols Winterbourne had embedded throughout his long deception. Most had been accounted for, but in the lower left corner, a string trailed into nothing. It led to a torn photograph, a woman's hand on the edge of a table, a broken teacup beside it, and a curious red smear on the saucer. Not blood. She had confirmed that. What bothered her was that this image didn't appear in any of the files recovered from Petra or Winterbourne's apartment. She turned the photo over. The same digit. 9. Why leave something so cryptic now? Was it a taunt? A test? A phone buzzed on her desk. Not her main mobile, the secondary burner she used for casework. She picked it up. No caller ID, only a voice message. Harriet hesitated, then pressed play. The voice was male, distorted, slightly, as though passed through an analog filter. But even under the manipulation, the cadence was familiar. I asked you to consider the edge of reason, Harriet. You chose the center instead. Look where lines converge. Look where silence is louder than speech. 9 is not a number, it's a position. The message ended. For the first time in days, Harriet felt cold wash through her. She scanned the board again. 9 strings led from Winterbourne's central node. 9 known subjects. 9 confirmed outcomes. But the 9th was unaccounted for. Subject 09. There was no name, no photo, no file. Just a blank square. And a notation she had originally dismissed. Transfer failed, archive relocated. Archive. Her fingers moved on instinct, pulling up the secured server she hadn't touched in weeks, an old case from years ago. Long before Petra, before Winterbourne even crossed her path. The case of a missing university researcher, declared. A suicide. No body found. His name was Dr. Elias Merrick. She ran a cross-check. Merrick's final email had been sent to a lab in Cambridge. That lab was later shuttered. Its lead researcher had moved on to a new post. A new post under Winterbourne's department. She blinked. Marrick had been Winterbourne's colleague. Not just a colleague, a co-author. And then, suddenly, a ghost. Subject 09 wasn't a prototype. He was the original architect. Harriet's heart beat faster. Had Merrick uncovered something too dangerous even for Winterbourne? Had he tried to stop the experiment before it began? Or worse, had he become its most perfected result? She turned back to her desk and opened the empty flash drive once more. If there was data, it had to be buried deeper. She initiated a forensic scan. The drive whirred. Lights blinking furiously. A single hidden file surfaced. E_Merrick_observation.mkv. Harriet opened it. Bracing herself, the screen filled with grainy footage. A man seated in a sparse, white room. Thin, nervous, hands trembling as he picked at the edge of a file folder. His eyes darted to the camera. Aware of it. Fearful. But he said nothing. Then, a voice unmistakably Winterbourne's, off-screen. You asked to see the endpoint. Elias. This is it. The man. Merrick shook his head violently. You've misused everything. This wasn't what we designed it for. Winterbourne's voice again, calm. Clinical. Design is interpretation. And I interpreted human limitation as an opportunity. Merrick whispered something inaudible, then lunged toward the camera. The footage cut. Harriet sat frozen. So Merrick hadn't died. He had been silenced, hidden, rewritten into the myth of a suicide. But why hide that now? Why give her this? She stared at the corkboard once more. A mystery never truly ends. It only recedes into the background until someone with the right eye picks up its trail again. Perhaps Winterbourne wasn't finished. Perhaps others were still out there unaware that they were part of a long game they didn't choose to play. She didn't know, not yet. But somewhere beyond the courtroom and the evidence, past the headlines and judgment, another truth waited to be uncovered. Another thread she hadn't yet pulled. Harriet stood and gathered her coat. The night was just beginning.